And thank you all for joining us in this panel discussion. We will begin with the presentation on the impact of COVID-19 in infrastructure development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Then we will discuss with our panelists some of the challenges that public-private partnerships have encountered in the context of the pandemic, some of the changes included in restructuring new projects that can play a role in recovering from the crisis context. So we have Gabriela Engler, Executive Secretary of the Undersecretariat of Partnerships with the Government of São Paulo, Brazil. Karin Granda, Director of Special Projects Supporting Investment in Peru from the University of Barcelona.
Con un MBA de Wharton.
Anaïs Julien, a specialist on the team covering the Latin American Capital Coverage Initiative. As we know, the COVID-19 impact has had some significant impacts on infrastructure development. And looking at the context, Latin American and Caribbean nations, just as well as the rest of the world, have looked at measures that include addressing not just the impact of the virus, but also the impact on the economic development. We know that public-private partnerships have been severely impacted by the pandemic itself, as well as measures to contain the pandemic. So we're looking at some of the infrastructure initiatives during fiscal crisis. So I would like to offer the floor to Laura, who can discuss some of their experiences. Go ahead, Paulo and Laura. Thank you. Thank you, Carolina. And I want to thank the team, and I want to congratulate the IDB Group for this initiative. The presentation that I'd like to share now with you is basically broken up into three components. I'll start off with my introduction, then we'll discuss some of the results of the research conducted, and then we will discuss the 9 key conclusions that basically make up the foundation of the best practices throughout the region that we believe will serve as a proposal in order to move forward in addressing such challenges as COVID-19, but also the dramatic reduction in demand that is also having a key impact. So the COVID-19 impact on the PPP contracts and projects can really be broken up into 3 key components. First, we've seen a dramatic reduction in the demand for these contractual arrangements. Also, a sudden and unexpected drop in levels of liquidity with the PPP contracts. We know that they have a demand component based on cash flow, and then the risk involved in cash flow, and then a disruption in the financial mechanisms that had been already ongoing before this crisis, and in most of the contracts that were already being implemented that suddenly faced the impact of the crisis. So basically, we're looking at 3 dimensions. We're going to look at first the before scenario, in other words, the existing regulatory framework before the reduction of demand, and then looking at whether these legal structures were sufficient and up to the challenge. And then we have the phase during the immediate responses by countries that Carolina was talking about. And this is basically broken down into 2 subcomponents, looking at this from the health perspective and then subsequently responses to confront using the some of the health emergencies within the contract stipulations. So we also looked at how we can address the post impact scenarios with existing contracts, especially those contracts that are already in the building stages, and what are some of the challenges derived from our analyses of initial measures in the subsequent projects that can be impacted to a large extent as a result of the needs of determining how to face future challenges of this nature and also determine how these could be managed more effectively, the more seamless flow, not just a possibility of looking at how we fund these, but also how this would not impact the bankability of the financial arrangements. I'd like to offer the floor to Laura so that she can discuss the methodologies and what were the results from the perspective of the 5 countries that we analyzed in this study.
Thank you very much, Pablo. Our methodological approach takes two aspects into consideration. On the one hand, we chose countries representative of the region, either politically, legally, in terms of the size of their economies or geography. So we selected Peru, Colombia, Brazil, Costa Rica, and Jamaica. And secondly, we focused on the transport infrastructure, as the World Bank highlighted that this was the sector most affected by COVID-19. We will thus present the general results of our research. In the before phase, we focused on the existing regulatory framework, and we saw that these countries use as a general principle the idea that risk must be assumed by the party that is best placed to handle it. And this is done at the time of structuring. Secondly, we looked at the legal institutions through which the economic balance of the contract could be restored, also taking into account the theory of unforeseen circumstances, sovereign acts, and the doctrine of frustration. Thirdly, we found that countries usually have slow response times to deal with these types of events, either due to the need to coordinate control mechanisms or because they don't have the necessary tools to approach solutions rapidly, so they often have to reinvent the wheel each time round. Fourthly, we see liquidity and contingency mechanisms that are good from a fiscal perspective, such as contingency funds, and mechanisms like the minimum guarantee income, which means that in the face of a drastic demand reduction, such as with COVID, the public and private sector have to share that risk. Based on this regulatory framework, we then moved on to see how COVID impacts PPP projects, if it leads to the restoring of the economic balance of the contract, and in any case, who must assume the related consequences. And we found some interesting things. First of all, the health-related measures adopted by states to prevent COVID-19, such as lockdowns, mobility restrictions, the closure of air and land borders, and even the suspension of collecting tolls, the case in Colombia and Peru. And we also looked at health measures to adopt biosafety protocols. And secondly, something that we are getting to see more now is that even in the absence of state-imposed restrictions, we are working on a home office basis, schools are still teaching remotely, and we are not traveling as much, which has had an impact. Both the government measures and the new dynamics has had an impact on PPP demand. And in the case of projects that are already in the construction phase, we can see how they have faced difficulties or impossibilities in fulfilling their contractual duties or meeting the deadlines in work, with the projects that were in the operation and maintenance phase having been particularly hard hit. And we see a drastic demand reduction. In the case of mass transport, up to 90% of demand uh, reduction took place at the height of the pandemic, with an immediate effect on the one hand, with less liquidity on the part of concessionaires, which led them to be unable to meet their financial commitments. But there was also a general impact, income reduction, in addition to the increase in costs resulting from the bio safety measures adopted, which changed the financial structure that had been planned when structuring the contracts. And the health measures adopted by the government are easily identifiable as sovereign acts, but the new social dynamics are hard to understand. Should that be assumed by the public party, the state party, or by the private party? So new projects should be structured and reconsidered in a more resilient fashion. Let's now look at the strategies and tools that were developed by different countries. First, we see that all tended to adopt measures seeking to uniformly modify or amend contracts. In Peru, the Minister of Economy and Finance issued guidelines on how the government should respond in the face of COVID-19 related impacts in the case of PPP projects. It is worth highlighting here that the continuity of the project must prevail, the continuity of public service delivery, so as to create trust among investors, but also to have measures that are fiscally sustainable. Secondly, we look at Colombia. The National Infrastructure Agency, along with control bodies and road concessionaires, organize working sessions to come up with an agreement adhered to by 70% of road concessionaires, recognizing COVID-19 as a release from liability event, which allows for an extraordinary additional term to complete projects that could not meet the originally planned deadlines. Special compensation may apply for lost earnings, and a request may be made for the national agency to recognize the higher costs related to biosafety measures. In Brazil, we see the federal and state level measures. At the federal level, the COVID-19 event was considered to be an extraordinary event, which should allow for an economic rebalancing of the contract. And the state of Rio de Janeiro created an administrative commission made up of state-level entities in order to rethink measures to mitigate the effects and impact of COVID on transport projects, capex reduction, or more flexibility in projects. We also have seen contingency funds. For example, the case of Jamaica with its natural disasters contingency fund to speedily deal with the problems that they were facing. In Colombia, under Order 482, concessionaires were allowed to extend the total term of their contracts by up to 20%. Although this does achieve some contractual rebalancing, it's not attractive for the privates, whose main need now is liquidity. Finally, we see the countries that are adapting projects being structured in order to ensure more resiliency in the face of changes and extraordinary events. Colombia has a liquidity mechanism, which is the income support, to allow concessionaires every year to have the difference between the expected and actual income. And if government should impose measures such as a lockdown, concessionaires will be allowed to recover 90% of the income reduction. Finally, in Brazil, we see projects, especially in the state of Sao Paulo, which seek to adjust the bans that originally provided for a sharing of risk among the public and private party, so that the public sector will now assume greater risk, and in subsequent years, when hopefully demand will be normalized, the private sector will assume those risks. I would now like to give the floor again to Pablo, who will tell us what measures may be adopted going forward by way of good practices to prevent the impact of events such as COVID-19 on projects. Thank you, Laura. Basically, our description of best practices is based on the fact that decision makers need to adopt main strategies as lines of action in order to implement measures going forward. What we have found is that probably the two best principal strategies are reinforcing bankability as a concept. And bankability here, not only as a possibility of securing financing for new projects, but also the possibility of securing refinancing for projects that are already underway, or the possibility of enhancing the dynamism of the secondary market to allow the entry of fresh funds into projects underway. Also, working on the continuity of projects, especially those that are in the construction phase. What we have seen is that projects are impacted regardless of whether they are structuring projects or projects that are in the maintenance phase, and even those that are in construction show not only liquidity constraints, but also the impossibility of acting as economic catalysts and job creators. So we think the two main goals that the strategy should aim at have to do with reinforcing bankability and enhancing continuity. So we have proposed a set of measures that do not reflect the response of a single individual country, but we think provide a good first list of what could be the best practices going forward. The first one is considering the dynamic risk reallocation concept, which was traditionally understood as a sort of general slogan which had to do with allocating risk to those who are best placed to assume the risk. We think this should be done considering those who are best placed at each point in time during contract performance. For example, what Brazil did in terms of altering demand bands to reallocate during performance of the contract, so that the ability to deal with risks when a change materializes, such a drastic demand reduction, you can share things between public and private automatically. Not throughout the life of the contract, but definitely during the period in which the demand reduction continues. Secondly, working on the resiliency of contracts. Civil law provisions provide for a basic agreement with subsequent amendments that are traditionally not just hard to secure, but also end up altering the whole contract discussion. It's not unusual to see in countries in our region PPP contracts with 20 or 30 amendments throughout their lives, which finally completely disturbs the original arrangements, as contracts are structured and restructured 4 or 5 times, dragging some of the original structuring components, but changing along the way. So we propose that we have systems under which the same contract can adapt to situational changes, for instance, by means of temporary amendments, which are automatically deactivated when the situation changes. So once the diversion caused by an unexpected situation ends, the contract may get back on the original track. Certainly, we need to work on the institutional capabilities of the region so that decision makers can act more swiftly. And although we need to keep the ethical safeguards in administration, decision makers need to be able to act without living in fear. You know, the kinds of lawsuits or claims that they may be facing, and that somehow force them to act more slowly. Liquidity relief is another point. We need to prevent situations where there is less of an appeal to contractors, and this goes against the idea of relieving the situation. The liquidity relief should be planned for in contractual normalcy time, so to speak, and we should look at that in advance so that it's easy to resort to the resources when there is a drastic liquidity reduction situation during the course of contract performance. Having stabilization funds or rainy day funds as part of the pre-structured and pre-funded liquidity relief measures. That could be very important. Secondly, or fifthly, in this case, working on uniform solutions. Our countries tend to bring projects out of the pipelines in groups or packages, and we have found that often the solution ends up being dependent on the initial structuring, and we deal with projects that are essentially in the same position as if they were different projects without having uniform language, which leads to competition in infrastructure projects or amongst them, and this creates difficulties for contractors who face different solutions for the same set of circumstances. In the sixth place, we think we need to prioritize projects that are underway. Certainly, projects in the structuring phase and projects in the medium term are essential for the economic dynamization that follows or will follow the most complex situation ever since the Great Depression. However, prioritizing projects underway is necessary because working on projects in the construction phase and ensuring that job creation and that the cash flow structure is tenable, all of that becomes necessary for planning purposes. We must also work on temporary hedging opportunity in the case of financing contracts. We need to offer more comfort when faced with situations of this kind. And although it's getting harder to find in the region general sovereign guarantee structures for contracts, sound arrangements in this regard, we do think it would be important for development banking and for multilateral banking, or perhaps for governments through direct action, to offer temporary hedging to help relieve the pressure on financial indicators and contracts underway. This will be very important not only for the initial moments, but also to prevent an impact on the bankability of projects. In the eighth place, we should speed up and facilitate the secondary market, reducing approval times and helping projects be exploited a lot more smoothly, which will allow the inflow of fresh resources. And although the pandemic is a very special case with a widespread effect around the world, it's true that dramatic demand reductions tend to happen more locally or regionally. So we should speed up the inflow of fresh funds. That would be key. Finally, we think it is extremely important to use the initiatives of an organization like the IDB, especially the single window, to create what we call a regional PPP project repository. We haven't been able to find in the region a good database reflecting the historical memory of contractual performance and also including the effects of implementation of measures during contract execution in a region. We want to conclude with the proposal that the PPP network, and in particular the single window, may serve as an instrument to create a database. Sometimes it's easy to get hold of the contracts and amendments, but it'll be difficult for decision makers to read the tangible effects of a decision when faced with impacts in the construction phase or when looking at things that already happened in other countries in the past. We think that creating this regional PPP project repository and this kind of contract history is key to infrastructure projects. And we think that by focusing on these new 9 best practices, the region will be better placed not just to deal with the effects of COVID-19, but also to deal with COVID-25, 35, or any other factor that may dramatically reduce demand. That concludes this presentation. Thank you very much, Carolina. Thanks to the network and to all the IDB group team. Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Laura, for that excellent presentation. And of course, after the event and on the PPP network's website, you'll be able to have a look at the paper launched as well by Anchor today, so as to expand the discussion, talking about the impact on projects. Now we talked about projects being executed. Now we will look a little further ahead, lessons learned, negotiations that have been concluded, and changes for structuring future projects. So let's move on to our panelists. Anais, from a private sector perspective, we have seen in the previous presentation the impacts of the pandemic on especially certain sectors, both due to the pandemic itself as also due to the measures adopted to contain it. How has the market responded to the impact on projects being executed? What kinds of opportunities do you think we may find in upcoming projects? Good morning, and first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, Denton, for the presentation and the report, which truly adds a lot of value to an investor like ourselves. And thank you to all the PPP work team at the IDB, which plays a very important role in the region for the development of PPPs in an effective manner. Well, we, Macquarie, as you know, are a global investor present around the world, and Latin America has been a strategic focus for several years already. We consider it a region with great potential and a major pipeline. The COVID crisis hasn't changed our focus, and quite on the contrary, we want to grow our footprint in the region. In fact, our first investment in Colombia was made right in the middle of the pandemic. It was the acquisition of a road near Bogota in Colombia. This was executed in October of last year. And although it's true that the crisis led to some delays, and it is also true that the market generally was somewhat slow last year, the drivers of the delays were mainly due to the impossibility of traveling. And for investors without a local presence, that was particularly important. Infrastructure projects where the due diligence and the ability to see the project are key elements. And also looking at the demand and the financial scenarios again created some delays. So that's somehow the theme of Denton's presentation. We had to wait and see what the reaction of each government and country would be, what solutions would be proposed. In terms of the greater impact, and we experienced this because the road we acquired was brownfield, it was operating. This had to do with the very sudden major drop in demand. But we had two pieces of good news. First, there was much debate at the time as to whether the recovery would be one way or another. And in the case of road infrastructure in the region, we saw very rapid recovery, and that was certainly very important to us. Another point, and this is something that emerges from Denton's report, the countries and governments have been very proactive in seeking solutions and in seeking discussions with us and in seeking out private investors, trying to see how we can work hand in hand to deal with the issues. And that has proven to be very important to find some solutions, and also to provide some comfort. It should be highlighted that the transaction we referred to, we signed before concluding the negotiations in the case of Colombia, but the dynamics that had been created and the dialogue that was already underway with the government gave us enough comfort to be able to sign. We saw that this was really on the right track. And in the case of Colombia, I think Pablo mentioned this, one thing we found very effective was the existence of that 4G framework agreement, the existence of very strong union CCI, which enabled negotiations in a very effective and swift manner, in addition to the reduction in costs attached to negotiations when they are conducted on a case-by-case basis. So this was good both for the private and public sectors. And as for the second question and what we see going forward, as I said, we keep a strong focus on the region. The crisis hasn't changed this. On the contrary, the reactions and proactivity we have seen make us all the more comfortable as far as our strategic focus is concerned. Given the crisis and the fiscal issue which Reina mentioned in the introduction, we do think the private sector will need to play a leading role to speed up the recovery and especially infrastructure works. We see great potential and interesting pipelines in terms of new projects, as well as in the case of the secondary markets. Pablo said, we see that the revitalization of some projects may provide good opportunities for us. So we stay highly focused, and we have also seen much proactivity on the part of government to include new provisions in contracts to provide for these occurrences. Of course, this is comforting. The key to any PPP is risk allocation. And so any steps that may help afford greater clarity and transparency in terms of risk allocation will make the project more appealing to the private sector, always. Thank you very much. And I think all of your remarks are very important, and it's important for participants to know that the private sector keeps its high interest in projects in the region. And of course, it's important to see how risks will be allocated, as Pablo mentioned when he talked about the dynamic allocation of risks, which may be crucial to projects going forward. I would now like to give the floor to Gabriela for her to talk a bit about that. Gabriela, in the
when we talk
case
about
of
Brazil's experience,
Brazil, we
and the
vemos que
pandemic
es
generating an impact on PPPs, despite the impacts, many public-private partnerships keep on thinking of different projects. So for the state government of São Paulo, how are you going to structure new projects? How do you see this scenario we are living now? Carol, first and foremost, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to take part in this event with this high-level debate. I've been very well impressed by the work conducted by the bank. I'd like to congratulate Pablo and Laura for their talk. It was very good, to structure the challenges, to think about the past and the future, what we'll be able to do in the future in order to address the problems caused by the pandemic. It was a real lesson. It's important to start by acknowledging the huge challenge we have not only in the state of São Paulo, but for the governments all over the world to structure new projects in such an uncertain moment as this. Uncertainty has several aspects here. For instance, we don't know about the demand for infrastructure. We have uncertainties about users' behaviors, cost of inputs. You know, we look at the daily price of inputs, and they change every day. They behave in a very unpredictable manner. So all this gives rise to a very uncertain scenario, and it's difficult for the public sector where to lean on in order to structure our projects. So a more conservative approach would be to wait and see and then resume project pipelines. But we're faced with another dilemma for governments: the need to help economic recovery. And we know how important infrastructure is in order to generate income, jobs, etc. So there is a very clear dilemma. On the one hand, we have to foster economic development in a very extreme circumstance, and on the other hand, we have to deal with many uncertainties and how to deal with things in an efficient and transparent manner. I think this might be one of the most challenging moments for infrastructure projects. Now, scrolling down to mechanisms adopted by the São Paulo state government in order to deal with uncertainties, and always remembering dilemmas faced by public treasures, because this is a moment of severe fiscal stress. You know, governments have to take on financial burdens, but we have fiscal challenges, fiscal issues as well. And we have to try and reduce project uncertainty. So it's certainly a very challenging moment. But to give you a few examples of what the state of São Paulo has been doing, I think the most important thing is that the risk of demand has to be rethought. Historically, projects in the state of São Paulo has allocated risks to the concessionaire, but we have been sharing this risk through bands. But as to highways, airports, this risk was up totally to the receiver of the concession. As your work mentioned, we have to have a dynamic allocation of risks. I'm going to give you the example of the concession of lines 8 and 9 of São Paulo metropolitan trains. The bid is scheduled for March, and we are going to have dynamic granting of risks. So everything that exceeds a given amount, 25% of the band will be taken on by the state government. And after the first year, when we hope that the pandemic is under control, the contract will use traditional rules about sharing demand risks with a wider band. Another thing I'd like to mention is the next highway concession launched by the state of Sao Paulo. For the first time, it's going to be a highway grant with the shared demand risk through bands again. As you see, we recognize that we have to address the issue of demand when we think of highways. And finally, I'd like to mention the intercity train, and we rely on the excellent consultancy of the IDB. This is a project where we have been thinking about payment per availability instead of using the demand risk allocated to the concessionaire. So we have a growing trajectory. We are rethinking about our background of allocating the demand risk entirely to the concessionaire. So this attitude, well, we have been thinking about risk allocation, demand risk allocation, but we are also rethinking liquidity mechanisms, as Pablo mentioned in his presentation. In highways, we have a few escrow mechanisms where we have liquidity reservations or provisions in order to face the need for rebalancing. We have to think about the exchange risk. The state of Sao Paulo was able to implement that in some projects, but we took a step back because we might have a fiscal impact when taking on this risk. But this is certainly very sensitive, especially to finance the project. And it's a huge dilemma on how to tackle the risk appropriately. And finally, we have to redo demand studies because we have new macroeconomic projections or forecasts. We have to redo CapEx studies or investigations because of the floating price of inputs. So it's certainly a huge challenge. On the one hand, we have growing uncertainties, and on the other hand, we have public power having to start projects in order to help economic recovery. That's it, Carol. Thank you. Thank you, Gabi. It was an excellent and interesting explanation so that everybody understands how the public sector is working on risk allocation, but also liquidity. And also there is the concern about, public treasure, public coffers that were affected by the pandemic. They had to allocate resources for other areas. And at the same time, they have to keep on expanding infrastructure projects in the region.
In the case of Peru, and with the Peruvian government state, COVID-19 has changed the way that you prepare and structure projects. Looking at Peru's experiences with a background in project management, especially in the area of concessions. So how has this impacted the risks, and how has the government responded in order to face these pandemic impacts? What were some of the major changes that you considered and implemented vis-a-vis future initiatives? Well, thank you very much, first of all, Carolina, for your kind invitation to this forum. Now, when we look at some of the key challenges faced by actors in this project, I think the question, well, first of all, it's very complex, and I'm going to try to make it as clear-cut as possible. How in Peru have we addressed the challenges posed by COVID, especially on the PPPs, and how do we view the future? How will we implement and address internally the risks and to prevent that this sort of situation in the future? So we've seen a dual approach. We've looked at it from the cause and effect perspective. We've looked at, and first of all, I would like to highlight some of the key considerations. Peru has issued guidelines in dealing with COVID regarding the role of the parties and the public sector officials as to how to implement measures in order to reduce and alleviate the impact of the pandemic. Let me break this down in the following pillars. First of all, we need to, first of all, remember that despite all the efforts undertaken in the design and implementation, these are still partial measures. So this leads me to the second idea. If the contract is not regulated, then we need to make changes to the contract or implement some, for example, dispute resolution mechanisms. And we might say, well, what has been developed in Peru? Well, this second scenario, which has to do with contractual arrangements and modifications needed. Perhaps this might be a little immature because the COVID pandemic has only barely reached a 1 year point, and we still haven't really seen cases, but we have seen measures with the implementation of clauses as well as other contractual arrangements. So we need to determine what are some of the weaknesses in these arrangements. This could be very simple. But there's a lot of complexity behind it. As the study has already stated, the COVID-19 impact have had different effects depending on the implementation, the fulfillment of the contract. But the reality is that the relevance of the payment mechanisms implemented in each contract, that in our country, we've had payment mechanisms depending on the various projects that highlight the need of reallocating risks. Let's look at it from a contractual perspective. At that level, we have two specific legal measures. We have for example, force majeure or act of God, where we have a act of God measure that includes all unforeseen events, including, pandemics can be included as acts of God that are beyond our control, that prevent the successful implementation of some of the contractual obligations. But this scenario, this legal measure dealing with the acts of God, don't have any compensation measures. It does have simply an impact on how all the parties are going to complete their contractual obligations. So many have used this legal remedy over the last 12 months, especially those are in the pre-operational phase, in the development of technical expertise provisions or the construction aspect. So this act of God clause requires there has to be, of course, a cause and effect relationship clearly evidenced and established. So this act of God clause in a contract, and then how this impacts on completing your contractual obligations. Also, we'll look at the concessionary perspectives, the cash flow perspectives in order to safeguard the continuance of the project. And this has also taken into consideration the regulatory framework that the Peruvian government has implemented, restrictions relating as a result of the pandemic, which includes a demand reduction and traffic reduction. How is this implemented in practice with regard to contract? You have clauses on reestablishing, and these are contracts dating back to early PPP contracts, which until now, none of the contracts never been implemented. Perhaps the pandemic or the general rules and procedures are the first cases after more than 20 years of implementing or these clauses. So basically, this reestablishment clause does not envision repay compensation, but in the face of saying, for example, any regulatory impacts on the part of the Peruvian government. And our projects basically work through these bands. It's not just any regulatory impact. It has to be a regulatory impact that generates, for example, if a regulation establishes an increase in costs, that goes beyond a certain percentage, let's say 5 to 10% band, then that is retained by the private sector, and then assimilating that difference on the base of the magnitude of what the team has developed, looking at the extension of the provision which is included in the regulations. So not all regulatory measures automatically trigger a compensation. And in practice, we've seen in Peru, directly or indirectly, a reduction of the flow and the reduction of demands. So we have these two criteria in projects. Nevertheless, it's not just limited to this. Many contracts also have specific regulations that can serve to manage risks. For example, I'm sure everybody knows when we looking at rate guarantees or specific areas relating to mobility. One of the least desired effects of the pandemic, we've seen indirect impacts, which include some of the parliamentary measures, which have been some of the key issues with laws passed by Congress. The Constitutional Court has ratified this, that can, through a suspension, for example, and the provision of compensation. Fortunately, Peru, in several decades, has developed strong institutions that allow mitigating these political intervention, and the suspension, for example, of tolls has been considered and ruled as unconstitutional. So that's in the practice aspect. We've seen the standard and procedures design. Now, in practice, in the transportation sector, where we have about 32 contracts, concessions, the idea of continuity in providing service to the public has remained constant. Those co-financed with the state risk demand have been the least impacted. You have some overcosts, but usually the major impact has been with regards to demand risk, especially during the first 3 months of the pandemic when the restrictions were more severe. Gradually, the economy was recovering, and with the work projects were resumed. There too, you have the Jorge Chavez metro construction that was gradually resumed. And in the second part of 2020, there was a new 18% increase in the last quarter of 2020. And this was basically triggered by solutions between the Ministry of Transportation and the concessionary parties. So they were able to re-energize the economy once again. Up until now, there's been no change to that. Now, what are some of the impacts of these contractual standards and procedures measures in terms of new projects? Well, the cause and relationship effect that I talked about earlier has dominated solutions, but some are cross-cutting. The direct impact, this relevance that has been given to the development of the healthcare, education, and sanitation projects. And healthcare is, of course, a key priority, but also sanitation and education. Sanitation is also linked to the healthcare policy. So this development and launching of projects has now gained relevance with the Peruvian government, which now I believe is becoming more relevant in government projects and development in particular. So when you try to develop these regulatory measures, there's always a perception of that the pandemic is going to be short. At least we're optimistic about that. But those projects that are in the portfolio, we talk about an implementation horizon over the next 4 or 5 years. So the direct impact, the direct concern about what's going to happen as a result of the effects of the pandemic, although it still hasn't taken center stage, it has been internalized through some contractual formulae. But there's a perception that the pandemic is only temporary, and therefore through the vaccination campaigns in the long term, the execution of the projects is not seen as a risk. So looking at the financial perspective, when we look at bankability, we believe that the bank interests and the financial markets in general is focused more on evaluating the sovereign risk behavior patterns that in Peru we have seen. And of course, this has a greater relevance, especially the reserve accounts in terms of managing liquidity. What else do we have? Well, what are we doing with the contracts? Well, there might be a future pandemic that is unforeseen in 2025 or 2030. So our act of God clauses absorb various potential assumptions, but what's required and what we're in the process of improving is that this will allow for adapting the contract in the face of unexpected scenarios, making it more agile so that you are able, and you're not going to penalize people for events that are outside of our control. We also have a concern over parliamentary actions that could impact on the sound legal measures and remedies already established. That's why we have these compensatory remedies and clauses. Now, this is a very important consideration. In Peru, Peru is following or is actually going through a transition phase in having payment mechanisms more linked to availability of services where the demand risk, given the conditions in the context, the payment mechanisms become instruments that will allow addressing on a more comprehensive level the concerns. So these are some of the contractual design and structuring that are concerned, but they're not the only ones. During the process, we also have the challenges of traveling, not only the evaluation teams, but we also have, we've had an accelerated migration of a physical system in terms of the bidding process to a virtual process that has also had an impact in our internal measures. And we've had a lot of foreign investors that are now restricted in terms of traveling. And in the practice, this has had an impact. And now we have a whole portfolio that has internalized these impacts in the context of contract design. And so the challenges before us, Carolina, are really overwhelming. Thank you very much for that, those inputs. I know that you're conducting active efforts to try to address these challenges you've so adequately described. So I know each country is addressing the crisis from their own perspective. We see that there's a lot of challenges regarding the planning and preparation of projects. So COVID has it introduced new problems, or has it just exacerbated the current challenges? And what can the IDB do to support the governments in these scenarios? Well, thank you, Carolina, and thank you, Pablo and Laura, for your presentations, and Gabi, and for your response, Gabriela. So COVID has really placed us in a situation that I believe has exacerbated some of the weaknesses in our infrastructure. And it's clear that the region does not have an adequate infrastructure that is at the level of their economic development needs. We see that, and it's reiterated by everyone working in looking at this gap in terms of infrastructure and providing quality services. We would have to be actually doubling our investment flows, but unfortunately, the fiscal situation that has always been in the region a challenge has now worsened significantly as a result of the crisis. As Karina already pointed out, we see a greater priority not only toward infrastructure projects related to healthcare and other pandemic associated issues, but also solutions that have occupied the fiscal sector in terms of they're already meager, but for the infrastructure, now we see an even greater emphasis. Now we tend to see a bias in cutting investment and in infrastructure more than in other developing regions around the world. In 2019, which we saw our flagship publication in our think tank that shows how the region has cut funding much more than other regions, developing regions, given the fiscal challenges. Looking at the magnitude, the region might come out at the end of 2022 almost doubling public debt. In other words, an average of about 40% of debt vis-a-vis GDP. And according to the IMF estimates, that would be exceeding over 80%. And this will be even more severely felt in the infrastructure context and in the maintenance of infrastructure as well, in addition to some of the solutions already mentioned in the Denton study. And I think, Gabi aptly described it as well as Karin. So looking at the first question, it's clear that the region has seen an exacerbation of the weaknesses that were already existing. So it's interesting, the comment raised by, the study's proposal, because if we look at the PPPs and how we can address the situation, I think now more than ever, we're faced with the challenge of long-term contracts that are not completed. So I think the risk allocation proposed by Pablo, I think it's an interesting concept that needs to be studied further. And I think the process in which these kinds of rebalancing of risk allocation is key, because we start off with a competitive perspective, and then we can include efficiencies. And it's important that we need to be wise in our reevaluation. And I think the proposal is very on the mark in that it needs to have these time-related clauses. It would not be advisable to reformulate contracts today with what little we know about what the future of the pandemic shows us. Or I think it'd be good to have these temporary solutions. We need to focus a lot on the process itself. What is the process going to look like in terms of reallocation of risks? This process needs to be also allocating incentives, that it's transparent and will allow for the greatest competitiveness possible. We need to start off with a great deal of creativity and innovation in terms of looking at alternatives without just completely stopping the contracts from being completed. The liquidity issues, I think, are going to be further exacerbated, and the multilateral banks play a pivotal role here, because we can use our leverage with guarantee mechanisms that can perfectly mitigate the uncertainties. Without wanting to repeat that term too much, we need to think about short, medium, and long-term solutions. And in the short term, as I already described, we need to have greater flexibility, and we need to be able to respond rapidly to many of the challenges posed by the new scenario. And in the medium term, as Pablo already pointed out, some of the greatest weaknesses that we have in the region include, and that's why we need to have this network established where we're able to share know-how that will be very useful to all of us. And looking at it from, for example, Gabi's experiences and others' experiences here, we still need to have that ex post analysis component, a systematic analysis that will allow us to learn from past processes. And that's something that we're focused on in the IDB group, and specifically in the one-stop shop mechanisms. There are experiences that new fiscal restriction scenarios can still be successful as we attract the private sector and reduce some of the burden that we know that the region has a fairly we still have a long way to go in terms of performance levels. And basically, our studies, the World Bank studies as well, show that the levels of efficiency are around 50%. For every dollar, every peso, every real that we use, we only get basically 50% return, and that is way below other developing regions around the world, which basically have a return rate of about 70, and in some cases up to 90% return rates. So there are experiences that have shown us some of the gains that we can achieve, not only in the construction, but also in the operational aspects. And I think this can open up a whole new opportunity in the future to try to, in terms of mitigating the challenges in regard to fiscal consolidation.
We have studies for water and sanitation looking at performance indicators in terms of losses and the kind of EBITDA improvements we can achieve, in some cases very substantial. And there are also studies dealing with ex post impact and evaluation conducted by Chile in the case of hospitals, and the efficiency gains in the case of construction phase hospitals, and the efficiency gains are very significant there too. And this we can use in the healthcare sector quite easily. Also, there is a reduction in the construction phase by over 35%. In the transport sector, as Laura highlighted in her presentation, one of the sectors most affected by the new scenario, rehabilitation and maintenance contracts are dealt with extensively in literature in Latin America and around the world, focusing on the greater efficiency of rightly structured contracts, allowing for up to 35% gains with maintenance cost reductions of up to 35% in the case of roads. So I think, given the fiscal situation in our countries nowadays, these are opportunities that should not be missed. And since time is running out, so as to wrap up, let me say, I think it is key to have mechanisms in place to prioritize projects that are smart and seek to engage the private sector in projects that can offer value for money, with the evidence showing that it's more efficient to bring on board the private sector, and especially in areas where we don't have as much certainty, and we should bring the private sector on board to ensure that there is value for money. That's the rationale of the PPP team and of the single window. We should have a neutral position supporting best practices for PPP project structuring, but we don't have a bias towards generating bankable projects that may be implemented more efficiently in other ways. And I think that clearly sets us apart from other kinds of teams or advisors. Our neutral position regarding the financing and implementation arrangements for projects make us an honest broker that can offer the best advice, combining both evidence-based knowledge, the strength of the sectoral knowledge of the IDB, also including the fiscal and transparency considerations, as well as potential guarantee instruments, in addition to the strong knowledge and experience with regard to bankability provided by IDB Invest specialists to help us enhance the bankability of projects. I will stop here. I've gone over by 4 minutes. Carolina, I would like to thank Dentons once again, as well as Gabi, Karim, and Anais for the excellent interventions. Thank you. Thank you, Gaston. And of course, you can count on us and the IDB group to carry on working on PPPs. I thank you all for your participation on our panel, and I hand it over to Claudia for us to carry on with the rest of our business. Thank you very much to everyone for being here.